200,000 miles from Earth, 3 men are trapped in a spacecraft that's dying around them. Oxygen leaking into space, the ship that's supposed to carry them home about to go dark. A few minutes ago, this was the most boring flight NASA had ever run. So smooth that Mission Control told the crew they were bored to tears. Then one of them flipped a routine switch, and 90 seconds later, the side of the ship blew apart. What the astronaut said next became the most famous line in space history.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Except almost nobody remembers it correctly. And that explosion wasn't bad luck or some freak accident. That bomb had been riding inside Apollo 13 for years. It was built by a dropped part, a wiring mistake nobody wrote down, and 8 hours of a heater slowly cooking a tank until it was ready to burn. This is the story of how a bit of boring housekeeping nearly killed 3 astronauts, and how a handful of exhausted engineers pulled off the greatest rescue in the history of spaceflight. A few seconds after that bang, one of the astronauts keyed his microphone. This was Jack Swigert, and considering the side of his spacecraft had just blown open, he sounded calm, almost matter-of-fact. You've probably heard the movie version of this line. Houston, we have a problem. But that isn't quite what was said up there. The real words were quieter, and in the past tense. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. We've had a problem. Like it was already behind them. Commander Jim Lovell repeated it a moment later, just as steady. And the strange part is, they were right. In a way, it really was already over. The mission to land on the moon had just ended. A different mission had taken its place, and nobody had trained for it. Keep 3 people alive long enough to get them home. So how do you go from bored to tears to fighting for your life? To get it, you have to understand just how ordinary this flight was supposed to be. And that comes down to where the space program stood in the spring of 1970. Just a few years earlier, landing people on the moon was the most impossible thing humanity had ever attempted. But by now, they'd actually pulled it off. Twice. In July of 1969, Apollo 11 set Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin down on the surface for the very first time. 4 months later, Apollo 12 did it all over again. So by the time Apollo 13 lifted off on April 11, 1970, going to the moon had started to feel almost normal. In fact, the big TV networks didn't even bother to carry the crew's live broadcast from space that evening. The most incredible journey humans can make, and hardly anyone was even watching. So who were the 3 men on board? Commander Jim Lovell was the veteran, on his 4th trip into space. He'd already flown all the way around the moon on Apollo 8, close enough to see the craters, without ever landing. Fred Haise was the rookie, itching to walk on the surface. And then there was Jack Swigert, who almost wasn't on the flight at all. And this was no joyride. Apollo 13 was meant to be the 3rd crewed landing on the moon, and it had a specific target. Lovell and Haise were going to set their lander down in a rough, hilly stretch of the moon called Fra Mauro. Scientists were desperate to get there because the rocks in that region were thought to be ancient material thrown out when a giant impact carved one of the moon's huge basins billions of years ago. Bring a few of those rocks home, and you might finally work out how old the moon really was. That was the mission. That was what all of this was for. Here's a detail I love. The original command module pilot was Ken Mattingly, but days before launch, NASA found out he'd been exposed to German measles and had no immunity, so with about 72 hours on the clock, they pulled him and swapped in his backup, Jack Swigert. But Mattingly never even got sick. He'd spend the whole ordeal on the ground in Houston, helping save the very crew that replaced him. Anyway, the mission itself was going almost suspiciously well. 55 hours in, now the evening of April 13th, coasting toward the moon, the biggest event on the schedule was a routine chore. Every so often, the crew had to stir the 2 big oxygen tanks, switching on little fans inside to mix the super cold contents so the gauges would read right. Swigert had done it before. It was housekeeping. It was nothing. So he reached over and he flipped the switch. And there is no reason on earth that flipping that switch should have done anything at all. Unless something inside that tank had been waiting for a spark. To find out why, we have to leave the spacecraft entirely and go back almost 2 years to a factory in Downey, California. Because that oxygen tank, the one about to explode, had a history. It was originally built for a different mission, Apollo 10, and while technicians were removing it for some upgrades, somebody dropped it. Not far, about 2 inches. The kind of bump that seems like nothing. But that little jolt knocked a tube loose inside the tank, and that turned out to matter enormously. Nobody noticed at the time. Now stack a second mistake on top of the first. Years earlier, NASA had upgraded the spacecraft's ground power from 28 volts to 65. And when they did, engineers upgraded almost every component to handle it. Almost everyone. The little thermostatic switches inside the oxygen tank heaters, the safety devices meant to shut the heaters off if things got too hot, got missed. They were still rated for 28 volts. Nobody caught it, and it wasn't written down anywhere. On their own, neither of those mistakes would have hurt anybody. But then came the third one, and this is where it all comes together. Remember that tube that got knocked loose when the tank was dropped? Because of it, during a test about a month before launch, that exact tank wouldn't drain properly. So the technicians did something reasonable. They switched on the tank's internal heaters to boil the leftover oxygen off as gas, and they left them running for 8 hours. But there was a problem. Those heaters were supposed to be protected by those little safety switches, the ones still rated for 28 volts. When the 65 volt power hit them, they didn't shut the heaters off. They welded shut, stuck in the on position. So for 8 straight hours, the heaters just cooked. Temperatures inside that tank very likely climbed toward 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and that heat baked and cracked the insulation right off the wiring inside. In NASA's own words, the tank came out of that test as, quote, a potential bomb the next time it was filled with oxygen. And then they filled it with oxygen, bolted it onto Apollo 13, and launched it into space, with 3 men on board who had no idea. So flip back to Jack Swigert and that routine switch, 55 hours into the flight. When he flipped it, electricity ran to those fans through that damaged, bare wiring, inside a tank full of pure, pressurized oxygen. And pure oxygen does not mess around. A tiny spark was all it needed. The wiring caught fire, the pressure inside the tank shot past its limit, and the whole thing ruptured, blowing the cover clean off the side of the service module and knocking out the second oxygen tank right next to it. That's your 90 seconds. It wasn't a random failure out in deep space. That fuse had been lit 2 years earlier on a factory floor, and it finally caught up with them. And look, if that kind of overlooked detail is your thing, you're going to love the rest of this. Hit subscribe and stick with me, because the way these people problem solve their way home is something else. Back in the spacecraft, the crew knew nothing about factory floors or welded switches. All they knew was that there'd been a bang, the ship had shuddered, and warning lights were flaring across the panel. Then Lovell looked out the window and saw something that made his stomach drop. A cloud of gas venting into space around the ship. That was their oxygen, their air, their water, their electricity, all of it, leaking into the void in front of his eyes. Down in Houston, the flight controllers first assumed it was a glitch, a bad sensor, a false reading. This kind of thing wasn't supposed to be survivable, so their brains reached for the less terrifying answer. But the numbers kept getting worse. One oxygen tank read 0, the other was falling. 2 of the ship's 3 fuel cells, the units that turned oxygen into electricity, were dead. And slowly, the horrible truth settled over the room. This was real, and they were going to lose the command module. So Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team made the only call they could. Forget the moon. Nobody was landing on anything. The single goal now was survival. And to survive, the crew had to abandon the dying command module, the cone-shaped part they were meant to ride home in. They powered it down completely to save its batteries for the one moment that actually mattered, re-entry, and moved into the only other pressurized space they had, the lunar module, the spidery little lander they'd brought to touch down on the moon. There was just one problem with using it as a lifeboat. The lunar module, nicknamed Aquarius, was designed to keep 2 men alive for about 45 hours on the moon's surface. Now it had to keep 3 men alive for around 90 hours, all the way back to Earth. The math did not add up. Not for power, not for water, and that's before you get to the air they were breathing. Let's start with the air, because this one is famous for a reason. When you breathe, you exhale carbon dioxide, and in a sealed spacecraft, that CO2 builds up until it kills you. Spacecraft scrub it out using canisters of a chemical called lithium hydroxide. But the lunar module's canisters were sized for 2 people, not 3, and they were getting used up far too fast. The CO2 was creeping toward dangerous levels. No problem, right? The command module had plenty of spare canisters, except for one small, maddening detail. The command module's canisters were square. The lunar module's slots were round. A square peg, a round hole, 200,000 miles from the nearest hardware store. So back in Houston, a team of engineers dumped onto a table an exact copy of everything the astronauts had up there, nothing more, and had to make a square filter fit a round hole using only that pile of junk. What they came up with is the most gloriously low-tech fix in space history. They built an adapter out of plastic stowage bags, cardboard torn from a flight manual cover, a couple of hoses, and a lot of duct tape. They even used a sock. Then they read the steps up to the crew, and the astronauts built the same contraption in orbit. They called it the mailbox. And this ugly, taped-together lump of garbage worked. The CO2 levels dropped. Crisis 1, handled. Surviving the air just meant they lived long enough to meet the next problem. To save power, they'd switched almost everything off, including the heat, and space is cold. The temperature inside the spacecraft dropped to about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. The walls turned slick with condensation. The crew, with no way to warm up, were exhausted and barely sleeping. And water was so precious that they cut their drinking down to about 6 ounces a day. That's less than half a can of soda. All 3 men got dangerously dehydrated. Fred Haise developed a painful urinary infection. By the end, the 3 of them had lost a combined 31.5 pounds. But they kept going. But none of that mattered if they couldn't actually get home. And this is where it gets wild. You'd think they just turned around and pointed back at Earth. They couldn't. The only engine big enough was bolted to the service module. The same service module that had just exploded. Firing a damaged engine could kill them instantly, so nobody would risk it. So they went with a plan that sounds backwards. Instead of turning around, they kept flying toward the moon. The idea was to loop all the way around the far side and use the moon's gravity like a slingshot to fling the spacecraft back toward Earth. No main engine required, just gravity and nerve. And as they swung around the back of the moon, they lost all radio contact with Earth and coasted farther from home than any humans had ever been. Even then, Haise and Swigert grabbed cameras to shoot the surface sliding by. Lovell, who'd already been this close on Apollo 8, was just staring at a landing site he was never going to reach. Coming back around, they still had to fine-tune the path with one more burn, using the lunar module's small engine. But with the guidance computer shut down to save power, they had to fly it by hand. Lovell held the ship steady with the Earth in his window while the engine fired, Haise and Swigert timing it on a wristwatch. One mistake, and they'd skip off the atmosphere or burn up. Lovell nailed it. After nearly 4 days of freezing, thirsty, white-knuckle survival, they finally reached Earth. But the last hurdle might have been the scariest of all. Before re-entry, they had to drop the damaged service module, and as it drifted past the window, they finally saw what had happened to them. An entire panel on the side of the ship, roughly a sixth of the whole service module, was just gone, blown clean off, wires and torn metal hanging out. Lovell said it looked far worse than anything they'd pictured. They'd been flying a wreck. And that raised a terrifying question. The explosion had happened right next to the heat shield, the layer protecting the crew from the thousands of degrees of re-entry. Was the shield damaged too? Nobody knew. They were about to bet 3 lives on it and find out the hard way. Then came the part every astronaut dreads. As the capsule slams into the atmosphere, the heat wraps it in a sheath of superheated plasma that cuts off all radio contact. A total blackout. For Apollo 13, that silence was expected to last about 3 minutes. Mission Control counted it down and waited. Nothing. 4 minutes passed. Still nothing. The blackout dragged on roughly a minute and a half longer than it was supposed to, and every person in that room was thinking the same unthinkable thing. And then, a crackle. A voice. On April 17, 1970, the capsule punched through the clouds under 3 perfect parachutes and splashed down in the Pacific, about 4 miles from the recovery ship, the USS Iwo Jima. All 3 men, alive. They called it a successful failure. A mission that failed at its goal, landing on the moon, but nailed the only thing that mattered in the end, bringing everyone home. And when investigators, including Neil Armstrong, dug into what went wrong, they didn't find one big villain. They found a chain of small, ordinary mistakes. A part dropped 2 inches, a switch nobody upgraded, a test nobody thought twice about. Each one harmless on its own, all of them together, nearly fatal. But here's what's easy to miss. By any normal measure, Apollo 13 was a failure. It never landed. And yet it became one of the most remarkable things NASA has ever done. This crew flew a crippled, freezing spacecraft 250,000 miles and back with almost nothing working, and every one of them came home alive. That rescue is still taught around the world as one of the great feats of teamwork under pressure, studied by people who want to learn how to stay calm when everything falls apart. And that slingshot around the moon set a record nobody planned on. Those 3 men ended up farther from Earth than any humans in history, about 248,655 miles out. And that record didn't just stand for a few years, it stood for more than half a century. It wasn't beaten until April 2026, when the crew of Artemis II looped around the moon on purpose and edged a few thousand miles past it. So for over 50 years, the people who had traveled deepest into space weren't a proud moon landing crew. They were the crew of a successful failure.